Somewhere beyond the green edge of the Nile Valley, where the fields end and the western desert begins to rise in pale shelves of stone and sand, an army disappears, not in the crash of a famous battlefield, not beneath the walls of a conquered city, not in a defeat carved proudly by the victors onto a temple wall. It vanishes into a landscape that seems designed to erase human intention. The road behind it fades. The road ahead breaks into heat, glare, and distance. Pack animals strain under water skins. Metal grows hot to the touch. Men trained for war begin to discover that in this country, the enemy does not need to charge. It only needs to wait. The story that survives is one of the most unsettling in ancient history. Around the late 6th century before the Common Era, after the Persian king Cambyses II has conquered Egypt, a great force is said to have marched westward from Thebes into the desert, its target, according to the tradition preserved by Herodotus, is the land of the Ammonians, the people connected with the oracle of Amun, far away among the oases. The number given is enormous, 50,000 soldiers. Their mission is grimly imperial, to punish a sacred centre that has refused submission or offended the king's authority. They march for days. They reach a place called Oasis. Then, somewhere beyond that point, the weather changes. A wind rises from the south. Sand fills the air. The sun disappears, and when the storm passes, the army is gone. It is a scene so vivid that it almost asks to be believed before it is examined. A whole military column swallowed by the Sahara. Men of an empire that stretches from the Iranian plateau to the Nile Delta, reduced to a rumour carried by desert wind. Before we go deeper, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, if this is the kind of history and mystery you enjoy, because this is not only a story about soldiers lost in Egypt, it is a story about the way empires remember their defeats, the way ancient writers shape terror into narrative, and the way archaeology can sometimes disturb a legend without fully destroying it. The desert west of the Nile is not empty in the simple sense. It has never been merely a blank space beyond civilization. It contains tracks, wells, limestone plateaus, salt flats, caravan roads, hidden hollows, and oases where human life clings with remarkable patience. But to an army moving through it, especially an army dependent on water, timing, guides, animals, and discipline, it can become a trap that needs no walls. The distance between safe places matters more than courage. A mist well can be more dangerous than an enemy ambush. A wrong route can turn order into panic. Even a powerful army can become fragile when every mouth needs water and every delay consumes the margin of survival. This is why the legend lasts. On one side stands the Persian Empire, organized, ambitious, and accustomed to absorbing kingdoms. On the other side stands the Egyptian Western Desert, silent, bright, and indifferent. The empire measures the world in provinces, tribute, roads, garrisons, and royal commands. The desert measures it in shade, distance, and water. In the legend, the desert wins. Yet the first danger in this story is believing it too quickly. Herodotus writes generations after the events, gathering accounts from Persians, Egyptians, Greeks, and local informants, and his history often preserves both valuable memory and dramatic tradition. He can be sharp, skeptical, and curious, but he is not a modern field archaeologist, and he is not always standing on secure ground. What survives in his account suggests that people in the ancient world did tell a story about a Persian force sent into the desert and never seen again. But whether that story records a literal sandstorm burial, a failed campaign, a political cover-up, an exaggerated number or a distorted memory of rebellion remains far less certain. Modern archaeology has made the mystery deeper, not simpler. The old picture imagines 50,000 Persians lying somewhere beneath dunes, waiting for discovery like a buried army of ghosts. Adventurers have searched for such remains, and sensational reports have occasionally claimed that weapons, bones, or fragments of equipment might belong to Cambyses' vanished soldiers, but the evidence remains incomplete. And no universally accepted discovery has proved that an entire Persian army was swallowed by a sandstorm. Silence is not proof of nothing, but it is not proof of the legend either. A more unsettling possibility has emerged from the study of Egypt's oases and the politics of Persian rule. The army may not have been marching toward the famous oracle at Siwa at all. It may have been heading into the southern oases, toward Dakhla and Karga, where evidence has drawn attention to an Egyptian rebel ruler named Pertubastis IV. In this reading, the lost army is not simply a natural disaster, it is a political failure transformed by memory. A Persian force sent into the desert may have been defeated by rebels, and the shame of that defeat may later have been softened, displaced, or buried beneath the more acceptable explanation of a freak storm. No single explanation fully accounts for every detail, but this possibility changes the emotional center of the story. The soldiers may not have vanished because the desert suddenly rose against them. They may have been erased because history had reasons to forget who defeated them. That kind of erasure is not unusual in the ancient world. Kings celebrate victories. They do not rush to preserve humiliations. Empires are built not only with armies and taxes, but with official memory. A rebellion that succeeds, even briefly, can become dangerous long after it's been crushed, because it proves that imperial power is not inevitable. A lost expedition can be turned into a cautionary tale about nature rather than a record of resistance. The figure at the center of this mystery, Cambyses II, is himself difficult to separate from hostile memory. As the son of Cyrus the Great, he inherits an empire of staggering reach. As conqueror of Egypt, he achieves what many Near Eastern kings had desired: control of the Nile kingdom, its wealth, its temples, and its ancient prestige. But the Greek and Egyptian traditions around him often grow dark. Scholars still debate how much of that portrait reflects actual policy, how much reflects Egyptian anger at foreign conquest, and how much comes from later Greek storytelling that preferred tyranny to complexity. The lost army fits that shadowed image perfectly. A proud king sends men into a sacred desert and loses them to divine or natural punishment. But the sand holds a quieter lesson. The mystery is not only whether the soldiers died in a storm, thirsted on a wrong road, fell in battle, or were never as numerous as the story claims. The deeper question is how an event becomes a legend, and how a legend can outlive the evidence that might have explained it. Somewhere behind the famous number, behind the wind from the south, behind the image of men disappearing under a moving wall of sand, there may have been real footsteps, real fear, real calculations, and real political consequences. An imperial order leaves the Nile. A column enters a world where maps are never enough. After that, the record grows dim. To follow the vanished army, the story must first return to the moment before the desert takes over, when Persia turns its gaze toward Egypt and Cambyses steps into the long, difficult inheritance of conquest. Before the army can vanish into desert legend, Persia must first arrive at the Nile. That arrival is not a raid, not a brief incursion, and not the desperate gamble of a minor king. It is the extension of the largest empire the Near East has yet seen. Cambyses II inherits from Cyrus the Great a realm already stretched across Iran, Anatolia, and much of the old imperial heartland of Western Asia. What lies to the southwest is Egypt, ancient, wealthy, heavily symbolic, and still one of the great prizes of the Eastern Mediterranean world. To conquer Egypt is not merely to add another territory. It is to take possession of a kingdom that has been old for longer than Persia itself, a land whose temples, grain, river traffic, and prestige reach far beyond its borders. The timing matters. Egypt in the late 6th century, before the Common Era, is no timeless monument standing outside history. It is a kingdom under pressure, connected to Greek mercenaries, Levantine politics, and the rival ambitions of larger states. Its last native rulers of the Sate period have revived royal power after centuries of foreign entanglement, yet that revival exists in a hard world. Persian strength grows, alliances shift. Coastal cities can no longer be treated as distant buffers. The eastern frontier matters more than ever. When Cambyses turns toward Egypt, he is not striking into a vacuum. He is entering a contested political system in which control of roads, ports, and loyalty among border peoples may matter as much as open battle. Ancient tradition preserves dramatic stories about why Cambyses invades, some personal, some moralized, some clearly shaped by later memory. Herodotus gives tales of insult, deception, and royal anger. Such stories make good narrative, but beneath them the larger logic is easier to see. Egypt is the last major independent power on the empire's southwestern edge. Leaving it unconquered means leaving open a wealthy rival with access to the Mediterranean, the Levant, and possible anti-Persian alliances. Taking it close as a flank secures tribute and presents the Persian king as master of a truly trans-regional empire. The campaign is therefore strategic in the simplest imperial sense. Egypt is too rich and too important to ignore. Yet the route into Egypt is already a warning of the conditions that will later haunt the story of the lost army. To reach the Nile from the east, a large invading force must cross difficult country at the edge of Sinai, where water is not guaranteed and movement depends on planning, transport, and local cooperation. Ancient accounts emphasize help from Arab groups who know the desert routes and can make the crossing possible. That detail is worth lingering over. Even at the opening of the conquest, Persian success depends not only on royal power but on guides, negotiated passage, and control over water in dry country. Empire looks grandest when viewed from a capital. On the ground, it often rests on the knowledge of men who know where a well lies beyond the next ridge. Cambyses' campaign succeeds. The decisive confrontation traditionally centers on Pelusium, Egypt's eastern gateway in the delta, where Persian forces break Egyptian resistance. After that, the road to deeper conquest opens. Memphis, the great political center, falls. The pharaoh Psamtik III, heir to a long line of Egyptian kingship, is defeated and removed. Egypt becomes part of the Achaemenid imperial order. The conquest is real, and its consequences are profound. For the first time, the Nile kingdom is ruled by the Persian great king. Later Greek and Egyptian narratives often turn Cambyses into a figure of excess, brutal, unstable, sacrilegious, almost theatrical in his arrogance. Some of that reputation may preserve real acts of violence that commonly follow conquest. Some of it may reflect the bitterness of a proud land subjected to foreign rule. Some of it is almost certainly exaggeration. Scholars still debate how far the worst accusations can be trusted. What survives in the record suggests a more complicated picture than the stereotype of a mad destroyer. Persian rulers, including Cambyses and his successors, do not govern Egypt only by wrecking it. They also step into its existing structures, use its administration, and claim pharaonic legitimacy in recognizably Egyptian terms. Conquest needs force, but rule needs continuity. That continuity runs through temples as much as forts. In Egypt, sacred institutions are not separate ornaments attached to the state. They are central to wealth, landholding, labor, writing, legitimacy, and cultural authority. To rule Egypt effectively, a conqueror must do more than occupy cities. He must situate himself within a landscape of gods, priesthoods, ritual obligations, and sacred geography. This is one reason the Western oases matter. They are not just remote watering points. They are politically useful nodes in a wider system that links caravans, local elites, agricultural pockets, and religious prestige. The Oracle of Amun in the far west, known later from Siwa, belongs to a world in which sacred authority can reinforce or undermine royal image. A temple that acknowledges the king strengthens order. A sanctuary beyond easy reach can become a moral problem as well as a strategic one. The Western Desert is therefore not marginal to the story of Persian Egypt. It sits at the edge of a royal control and at the intersection of several kinds of power. There are caravan routes leading toward Libya and inner oasis chains. There are communities living beyond the Nile's direct agricultural world. There are places where Egyptian identity mixes with local traditions and long-distance movement. There are distances that make rapid intervention difficult. For a newly installed foreign ruler, these regions matter precisely because they are far away. Frontiers are dangerous not only where they're attacked from outside, but where command weakens as it travels outward from the center. This helps explain why a king who has just conquered one of the world's oldest states might still feel insecure. Victory at Pelusium does not automatically mean unquestioned obedience in every corner of the land. Some Egyptian elites may accommodate the new regime. Others may quietly resist it. In remote regions, especially the oases, local loyalties and practical power may matter more than proclamations issued from Memphis. If Persian authority is to feel real, it must reach not only river cities but the margins. It must know the roads. It must monitor rebels. It must secure supply lines. It must also show that the king's command extends into places that seem half outside ordinary geography. And this is where the later legend begins to make political sense. If Cambyses sends a force westward, whether to punish the Ammonians, to bring a rebellious oasis to heel, or to suppress a challenger whose memory later grows faint, he is acting in a way entirely consistent with imperial logic. New conquerors are always tempted to prove that the periphery is no refuge. The very remoteness of the desert may make action feel necessary. A frontier that ignores the king invites imitation elsewhere. But a frontier expedition is never the same as a set-piece invasion. An empire can bring overwhelming numbers against Egypt's eastern approaches because it knows roughly where it is going, how to reach it, and what prize stands at the end of the march. The desert west of the Nile offers no such clarity. Distances stretch, wells dictate pace, local intelligence becomes everything. The farther authority moves from the river, the more fragile it becomes. By the time Cambyses stands as ruler of Egypt, then the ingredients of the later mystery are already in place. There is a king with reason to assert control. There is a newly conquered land whose obedience cannot be taken for granted. There are temples and oases whose significance is larger than their size. There is a desert that looks empty only to those who do not know it. And there is, somewhere between imperial ambition and environmental reality, the possibility of a disaster that could later be retold as myth. To understand how that myth reaches us, the story now has to pass through the man who preserved it best and complicated it most, Herodotus. The vanished army reaches the modern world through a voice that is both indispensable and dangerous. Herodotus is the great preserver of the tale, and without him the story might have dissolved into the margins of Egyptian and Persian history, leaving only scattered hints of unrest in the oases and a few difficult traces in later scholarship. Yet the same voice that saves the mystery also wraps it in uncertainty. Herodotus gathers stories with extraordinary curiosity, but he writes in a world where memory, rumour, moral lesson, political resentment, and travel report often stand side by side. He is not careless, but he is not neutral in the modern sense. He frequently tells the reader when he doubts something, yet he also preserves accounts because they are what people say, and because what people say can reveal how the past is imagined. In his version, the lost army appears within a larger sequence of Cambyses' Egyptian disasters. This is important, because the story does not stand alone. It is part of a portrait of a king whose ambition outruns judgment. Herodotus describes Cambyses sending spies toward Ethiopia, growing angry at what they report, and deciding to march far south without adequate preparation. At Thebes, according to the account, he divides his force. The main body continues toward Ethiopia, while about 50,000 men are ordered westward. Their task is severe: to subdue the Ammonians and burn the seat of the oracle of Zeus, whom the Greeks identify with Amun. It is a mission framed not merely as military action, but as an assault on sacred resistance. Already, the story carries the shape of warning. Cambyses is shown as a king who does not understand limits. He thinks command can overcome geography. He treats distance as obedience delayed. He sends men into places where provisions, water, and local knowledge decide survival more surely than royal anger. Herodotus' Cambyses does not merely fight enemies, he collides with the edges of the world as Greek imagination understood them. Ethiopia lies toward the far south. The Ammonians lie beyond the known sands. In both directions, the king's will stretches outward until it breaks. The detail that gives the lost army its power is almost brutally simple. Herodotus says the soldiers sent against the Ammonians set out from Thebes with guides, and that they are known to have reached a city called Oasis, inhabited by Samians and lying 7 days' journey from Thebes across sandy desert. Greek speakers call it the Isle of the Blessed. After that point, knowledge fails. They do not reach the Ammonians. They do not return. What happens beyond the oasis is known, Herodotus says, only from the Ammonians themselves and those who've heard the account from them. Then comes the famous explanation while the army is crossing the sand, about halfway between Oasis and the Ammonians. It pauses for the morning meal. A violent south wind rises. It carries heaps of desert sand over the men. They are buried and disappear. This is the legend in its purest form: a military column halted in daylight, eating before the march resumes, unaware that the sky itself is about to become their tomb. There is no final battle, no heroic last stand, no survivor staggering back to Thebes with a broken spear and impossible news. The event ends in absence. That absence makes the story feel larger. A massacre leaves bodies, a defeat leaves prisoners, a retreat leaves shame and witnesses. But a sandstorm leaves a blank so complete that it becomes almost supernatural. And yet Herodotus quietly gives us reasons to hesitate. He does not claim to have confirmed the end of the army. He identifies the source of the final explanation as the Ammonians. That does not make it false, but it matters. The Ammonians are not detached observers. In the story, They are the intended victims of Cambyses' expedition. A tale in which the invading force is swallowed before reaching them would serve their memory well. It turns survival into vindication. It implies that the land, the god, or the desert itself defended them. Even if the event began as a real military failure, its retelling may have grown into a sacred warning: those who march against the oracle do not return. The number 50,000 also asks to be treated with care. Ancient numbers are often meaningful without being exact. They can signal scale, disaster, royal excess, or awe. A force of 50,000 crossing a western desert route would be a staggering logistical operation, especially if the journey required reliable water, fodder, food, and coordination over long stretches of arid land. It is not impossible for large forces to move through harsh country with preparation, but the figure in Herodotus may be inflated, rounded, or shaped by the desire to make the disappearance almost unimaginable. A smaller expedition could still be politically important and militarily serious. A smaller disaster could still become a giant legend once retold through generations. The geography in Herodotus is equally important and equally slippery. The place called Oasis has often been associated with Karga Oasis, though the ancient terminology and the roots remain debated. Siwa, connected with the oracle of Amun, lies far to the northwest, not simply along a direct or easy line from Thebes. If the expedition truly set out from Thebes toward the Ammonians, the route would have required decisions that modern scholars still examine closely. The desert is not a flat blank map where one can draw a straight line between names. It is a network of possibilities, some practical, some punishing, some dependent on wells known to locals. Herodotus gives us a path in narrative form, but not enough detail to reconstruct the march with confidence. This is why his account has never stopped provoking argument. It contains just enough precision to feel historical Thebes, Oasis, the Ammonians, the number of troops, the guides, the morning meal, the south wind. But it also contains just enough uncertainty to resist closure. It comes from a writer who preserves multiple traditions and often organizes events around moral patterns. Cambyses is reckless. The desert punishes recklessness. Cambyses threatens a sacred place. The sacred landscape destroys his men. The structure is powerful because it makes emotional sense. Whether it makes literal historical sense is a harder question. Still, dismissing Herodotus entirely would be too easy. Legends often form around a core of real events. A Persian force may indeed have been sent westward. It may have failed catastrophically. It may have disappeared from official memory because the cause was embarrassing or politically dangerous. The Ammonian version may preserve the memory of that failure in a form shaped by religious pride and desert imagination. What survives in the record suggests not pure invention, but a story that has passed through several filters before reaching the page: Persian imperial silence, Egyptian resentment, Oasis memory, Greek curiosity, and Herodotus's own desire to show how power meets its limits. The Lost Army therefore begins not with bones under sand, but with a text. The first archaeological site is the sentence itself. Every word matters because every word has carried the mystery for more than 2,000 years. The army reaches Oasis, then disappears from knowledge. A wind rises, and the page fills the silence with sand. Modern investigation cannot simply ask where the soldiers are buried. It must ask who told the story, why it was told that way, and what kind of failure might have needed such a haunting explanation. If the story is to be believed in its traditional form, the destination of Cambyses' western expedition is not just any oasis, but one of the most symbolically charged places in the Libyan desert. Far beyond the cultivated Nile valley lies the oasis later known to Greeks as the home of the oracle of Amun, whom they equate with Zeus and whom Egyptians know as Amun. In the imagination of the ancient Mediterranean, this is a place at once remote and authoritative, a green pocket of springs and palms hidden within a sea of sand, where divine approval can be sought at the edge of the known world. It is precisely the kind of place that attracts legend, because its physical isolation gives spiritual prestige a natural stage. A voice that speaks from deep desert seems to belong to a different order of reality. Siwa, as it is usually identified today, is not a minor stopping point. It sits far to the west of the Nile, linked by difficult routes to other oasis chains and to the wider desert world that stretches toward Libya. The environment is strikingly self-contained. Fresh water emerges where none should exist. Date palms gather around springs. Salt lakes shimmer under hard sunlight. The settlement appears less like an extension of the river world than like an island stranded inland. And ancient travellers often respond to it in exactly those terms. The further one moves from the Nile, the more the oasis seems to exist by its own logic. That isolation helps explain why a sanctuary there could acquire such reputation. People do not only travel to remote shrines for answers, they travel because remoteness itself feels like evidence of power. The oracle of Amun stands within that atmosphere. In Egyptian tradition, Amun is one of the most important gods of kingship, legitimacy, and cosmic order, especially associated with Thebes. But in the western desert, Amun also has a local face, rooted in oasis worship and adapted to the needs of communities living far from the river's monumental centres. Greek visitors later transformed this into the oracle of Zeus Amun, a place of consultation where rulers and travellers seek divine confirmation. The most famous later visitor will be Alexander the Great, who crosses the desert to consult the god and comes away with a prestige that helps turn conquest into sacred destiny. That happens generations after Cambyses, but it shows how enduring the site's aura becomes. A desert oracle can matter politically far beyond its modest population, because it offers something empires want, and fear at the same time independent legitimacy. This makes Herodotus' version of the expedition intuitively plausible. A conqueror who has just taken Egypt might well wish to punish or silence a sacred centre beyond direct control, especially if that centre is associated with a god whose authority touches kingship itself. If the oracle refuses submission, condemns the invader, or remains loyal to older powers, it becomes more than a religious nuisance. It becomes a symbolic rival. The king rules the river, but the desert god does not acknowledge him. For a ruler trying to secure a newly conquered land, such defiance could feel intolerable. There is also a practical side to the problem. Oases are not only sacred stations, they are strategic nodes. They hold water, agriculture, and movement. They anchor caravan routes and communication lines through country that otherwise seems impossible to cross. Whoever holds an oasis controls more than a patch of green. He controls survival on the road between distant regions, in the western desert, where travel depends on knowledge of wells and seasons. An oasis can function almost like a fortress without walls. A sanctuary attached to such a place combines practical and spiritual influence in one. To leave it outside imperial oversight is to leave a pocket of autonomy in the desert. Yet this traditional picture, persuasive as it is, begins to shift once modern scholarship takes a harder look at the geography. The classic story assumes that the Ammonians of Herodotus point towards Siwa, and that the expedition marches from Thebes across the desert in that direction. But the route is difficult to reconcile with some of the practical realities of movement, especially for a large force. The western desert is navigable, but not casually. Distances between oases are substantial, and routes from the Theban region do not necessarily lead naturally towards Siwa in the way a simple map might suggest. Once the romance of the lost army is set aside, the problem becomes more technical. Why would a newly established Persian administration launch a massive expedition across such punishing terrain toward that specific destination? And how would it sustain that march? This is where the target itself becomes part of the mystery. Scholars still debate whether Herodotus's Ammonians truly reflect a campaign against Siwa, or whether later memory has fused several strands together. Modern archaeological work in Egypt's western oases, especially in Dakhla, has drawn attention to a different possibility, that the most immediate threat to Persian rule may not have been a distant oracle at all, but a rebellion closer to the southern oasis system. A local Egyptian ruler, Petubastis IV, appears to have led resistance in the Dakhla region during the early Persian period. If a Persian force was sent westward to crush that rebellion, then the target of the expedition was not primarily theological or legendary, it was political. That shift matters enormously. A march against Siwa makes the story feel like a morality tale about a proud king attacking a sacred place and being destroyed by nature. A march against Dakhla or nearby oasis centres makes the story feel like imperial counterinsurgency in one of the harshest environments on Earth. The men are no less lost, but the meaning of their disappearance changes. They are no longer simply victims of divine desert wrath. They may be participants in a failed campaign against a very real challenger to Persian control. Still, the old tradition cannot be discarded too quickly. The Oracle of Amun is too important in later memory to ignore, and ancient storytellers often preserve truth by attaching it to the strongest symbolic frame available. Even if the original campaign was aimed elsewhere, the idea of an army sent against a powerful desert sanctuary could easily absorb the memory of a Western disaster. The Ammonians, whether in direct connection to Siwa or in a broader oasis sense, represent a people living beyond the easy reach of the Nile state. To say that Cambyses sent an army against them is to say that he tried to impose authority where authority was least secure. The oasis target, then, is not only a place on a map, it is a test of how empire imagines distance. From the perspective of a conquering king, an oasis can appear small, isolated, and vulnerable. From the perspective of those who live there, it is the center of a local world, defended by knowledge, terrain, and time. Water sources are known to insiders, tracks shift. Harsh weather is familiar to some and fatal to others. An army can arrive with numbers and weapons and still be weaker than the landscape around it. That may be the quiet truth hidden inside both the legend and the revisionist reading, whether the target is the famous oracle at Siwa or a rebellious centre in Dakhla. Cambyses' problem is the same. He has conquered Egypt, but he has not yet mastered its margins. He can occupy Memphis, but the desert obeys different rules. He can claim the titles of pharaoh, but a title does not refill water skins. He can send men westward under orders, but the further they move from the Nile, the less the language of empire guarantees success. And so the target glimmers in the distance as both sacred image and strategic necessity, an oasis of palms, springs, mud brick sanctuaries, and local loyalties, somewhere beyond the river world, somewhere inside the widening field of imperial anxiety. To reach it, the army must do more than march. It must cross a country where every mile converts power into vulnerability. An army becomes a different creature when it leaves the river. Along the Nile, power can move with the current of civilization itself. There are fields, canals, villages, storehouses, boats, scribes, granaries, livestock, and temple estates. Men may suffer on campaign, but the landscape still offers the basic grammar of organized life. Grain can be collected, water is visible, shade exists, messages can pass between settlements. A commander can think in terms of roads, supplies, and obedience. But the moment a large force turns westward, away from the river's green line and into the desert margins, that confidence begins to thin. The empire does not vanish immediately, its banners still rise, its officers still give orders, its soldiers still march in ranks. But the ground under the whole structure changes, and with it the meaning of command. The Persian Empire is not a primitive warband stumbling blindly into foreign country. It is one of the great administrative achievements of the ancient world, able to move men, animals, silver, grain, craftsmen, and information across vast distances. Its armies are not made of Persians alone. Their imperial forces, often drawing on many peoples, languages, weapons, and traditions, archers, spearmen, cavalry, engineers, servants, guides, interpreters, and pack handlers can all be part of the living machinery of campaign. In better watered regions, such diversity is strength. It allows a king to project force far beyond the homeland. In the western desert, however, every added body becomes another demand. Every soldier needs water. Every animal needs fodder and water. Every servant, every guard, every officer, every messenger, every spare beast increases the burden. The larger the force, the more impressive it appears at the start, and the more dangerous it becomes if the supply calculation is wrong. This is one reason the famous figure of 50,000 soldiers should be heard with caution. A force that size would be massive even in favourable conditions. In the desert, it becomes almost a moving city without wells of its own. The number may preserve the memory of a large expedition, or it may express the scale of catastrophe rather than an exact head count. Ancient historians often use great numbers to make a disaster legible to the imagination. Yet even if the real force were much smaller, the logistical problem would remain severe. A few thousand men can still be difficult to sustain if they cross country, where the next water source is uncertain. A column does not need to be impossibly huge to be doomed. It only needs to be too large for the route it has chosen. Water is the first ruler of the march. A human being can carry only so much, and a soldier already burdened with weapons, clothing, rations, and perhaps tools cannot become a walking reservoir. Water skins are heavy when full and useless when empty. Ceramic containers preserve liquids but break and add weight. Pack animals extend range, but they also consume what they carry and suffer under heat. Camels are often imagined as the obvious solution, but their widespread military use in this region and period cannot simply be assumed in the familiar later sense. Donkeys and other pack animals are valuable, but they are vulnerable. A lost animal is not only a dead beast, it is lost water, lost food, lost equipment, and sometimes lost mobility for men already near the edge of endurance. Food creates a second chain of dependence. Soldiers can march for some time on grain, dried provisions, dates, or other compact supplies, but food is useless without water to prepare or digest it. Animals need fodder, and fodder is bulky. In the Nile Valley, fodder can be gathered or requisitioned. In the desert, it must often be carried or found in sparse patches near wells and settlements. Every plan therefore becomes a compromise between weight and distance. Carry too little, and the army risks starvation or dehydration. Carry too much, and the column slows, animals weaken, and the journey grows longer, consuming the very supplies meant to preserve it. Then there is heat. the Western Desert is not simply hot in a theatrical way, as if it exists only as a furnace under noon sun. It is more subtle and more dangerous than that. Days can be punishing, nights can grow cold, wind can dry the mouth and eyes until thirst seems to begin before exertion does. Light can flatten the horizon, making distance hard to judge. A ridge that appears close may take hours to reach, in some seasons. Movement may be possible only in carefully chosen parts of the day. Marching at dawn, resting under makeshift shade, and moving again in late afternoon can preserve strength, but it also complicates timing. A military schedule made for ordinary roads begins to fail when the sun becomes one of the main commanders. The desert also attacks through sameness. Soldiers trained to follow roads, rivers, cultivated land, and visible settlements enter a world where landmarks can be deceptive. Limestone outcrops, gravel plains, dunes, and low escarpments repeat themselves. Tracks vanish under wind, a route that local guides know through memory. Stars, ground texture, and hidden wells may appear to outsiders as nothing at all. This is one of the lesser-known truths of ancient desert travel. Geography is not just physical, it is social knowledge. A road exists because people know how to use it, where it bends, when a well is reliable, which depression holds water after rare rain, which path is safe for animals, and which stretch should not be attempted in certain winds. Without that knowledge, an army can stand on a route and still be lost. Guides, therefore, are as important as officers. They are also a point of vulnerability. A guide can save a force, mislead it, abandon it, or be accused of betrayal when conditions go wrong. In many ancient campaigns across difficult terrain, local expertise is the hinge between imperial confidence and disaster. Cambyses' forces, like many armies before and after them, would have depended on people who knew the desert better than the king did. That dependence may have been uncomfortable for imperial commanders. It is one thing to command archers and spearmen. It is another to admit that survival rests on men from marginal communities whose loyalty may be practical, negotiated, or uncertain. The route itself would shape the army's fate long before any storm or enemy appeared. If the expedition is imagined as moving from Thebes toward Karga and beyond, it would first pass through a transition zone where the Nile's presence fades but has not yet been psychologically forgotten. The first days may feel manageable. Supplies are full, men are rested, the chain of command is intact, the river is behind them, but not yet impossibly far away. Then the march enters deeper isolation. The memory of water becomes stronger than the sight of it. Every decision begins to matter more. A delayed start, a sick animal, a broken water container, a disagreement among guides, or an unexpected wind can consume a margin that looked safe when calculated from a palace or camp. If the target is Siwa, the challenge grows even stranger, because the route across the western desert is not a simple westward road from Thebes. If the target is Dakhla, the march is more plausible but still dangerous, especially if a rebel force or hostile local network controls wells or watches the movements of the invaders. In either case, geography becomes political. The desert is not merely scenery. It decides which communities can resist, which armies can advance, and which stories later seem believable. A place that looks empty on an imperial map may, in practice, be defended by distance itself. No single explanation fully accounts for the vanished army, but logistics expose the fragility beneath the legend. Before any sandstorm rises, before any possible ambush, before any later storyteller turns disaster into divine punishment, the expedition is already a wager. Cambyses' authority is being translated into movement across land that does not care about royal authority. The soldiers carry the empire with them in miniature weapons, orders, discipline, supply, ambition, and fear. But each step westward makes that empire heavier. The desert does not have to defeat them suddenly. It can begin by making every ordinary need difficult. And so, beyond the last dependable reach of the Nile, the army becomes a line of men and animals stretched across brightness and dust, moving from one uncertain promise of water to the next. Somewhere ahead lies an oasis, a rebellion, an oracle, or perhaps only the next fatal mistake. Somewhere behind lies Egypt, newly conquered but not fully controlled. Between them is the place where command turns into endurance. At first, the march may not look like a mystery at all. It may look like what armies have always looked like when they leave a settled world and push toward a harsh frontier, a long, noisy, practical procession of burden and discipline. Pack animals move in uneven lines. Waterskins sway and creak. Officers ride or walk near the front and flanks, watching for disorder before it spreads. Soldiers shift weapons from one shoulder to the other, their movements becoming more economical with each mile. The bright confidence of departure begins to fade into routine. Men stop talking as much. The business of marching narrows thought to the next halt, the next well, the next ration, the next command. The farther they go, the less the expedition resembles a grand imperial gesture, and the more it resembles a negotiation with exhaustion. A desert march lives by rhythm. The force cannot simply move whenever it wishes. It must adapt to light, temperature, and terrain. Dawn offers the best chance to cover distance before the heat grows oppressive. Midday may demand rest, though rest in the desert is often a relative term, taken in cramped shade beside baggage, under cloth, or near whatever rock or depression offers minimal shelter. Then movement resumes later, when the sun begins to lower. Night travel is also possible if guides are skilled and the route permits it, but darkness creates its own risks. Animals stumble, units drift apart. A delayed or disoriented segment of the column can become a crisis if water is being rationed tightly. What appears in narrative as a single army on a single path is in practice a constantly adjusting organism, fragile because it must keep hundreds or thousands of individual needs aligned. The first major staging point, in Herodotus' account, is a place simply called Oasis, described as lying 7 days from Thebes across sandy desert and inhabited by settlers from Samos. That detail is curious and revealing. Greek communities are not absent from the Egyptian world, and mercenaries, traders, and transplanted populations move through the eastern Mediterranean in ways that often surprise modern readers. The presence of Samians, if accurately remembered, suggests a settlement shaped by cross-cultural movement and political transplantation, not a purely isolated Egyptian enclave. It also reminds us that an oasis can be a social crossroads rather than an isolated green dot. Traders, soldiers, exiles, priests, cultivators, and officials may all pass through or settle there. For a Persian expedition, such a place would be more than a resting point. It would be a node of information, guidance, and last reliable reorganization before a harder stage of travel. If the army truly reaches this oasis, the men would likely experience a temporary return of order. Water can be replenished, animals can recover, news can be gathered, local conditions can be discussed, wounds, illness, and shortages can be assessed more honestly than during the strain of the open march. It is often at such points that an expedition either regains its strength or reveals its weaknesses. A column already stretched too thin may arrive with dead animals, broken containers, exhausted soldiers, and conflicting reports from guides. Commanders then face difficult decisions. Should the pace be reduced? Should part of the baggage be abandoned? Should a smaller detachment move ahead? Should more guides be hired? Ancient sources do not describe these practical moments in detail, but they are where campaigns are often saved or ruined. Beyond the oasis, the march enters the region where story overtakes evidence. This is the threshold between what is broadly imaginable and what becomes obscured by legend. If the expedition presses onward into deeper desert, it does so with the knowledge that retreat is now harder. The supply line grows longer. The last major watering point recedes. Every next destination matters more. Here the column likely becomes narrower and more vulnerable, its pace regulated by the slowest animals and weakest men. Dust rises from thousands of feet, equipment wears down, tempers shorten. Even without catastrophe, morale can begin to change in such conditions. Soldiers do not need to mutiny to become dangerous to their own mission. They only need to lose confidence that the people leading them know where they're going. This is especially true if the target remains far away or uncertain. An army marching toward a visible city can endure much because the objective grows clearer each day. A desert expedition toward an oasis, a sanctuary, or a rebellious settlement often advances through abstraction. Men are told what lies ahead, but they do not see it. They see only the next stretch of open ground, the next ridge, the next hardship. In such circumstances, rumour becomes a second climate. Some may say the enemy waits at the wells. Others may fear treachery among local guides. Others may begin to suspect that the officers themselves do not know the route. Fear spreads most effectively where information is thin. If the destination is Siwa, the distance compounds these pressures. If it is Dakhla or another oasis in the southern system, the march is shorter in a relative sense, but may enter politically hostile territory sooner. Either way, the expedition can no longer rely on imperial scale alone. A large force in a narrow logistical corridor is not automatically strong. It can become clumsy, thirsty, and slow, like a beast too large for the path it follows, a smaller defending group. If familiar with local wells and concealment, may possess a decisive advantage. The desert rarely rewards size unless size can be fed and watered. The famous image in Herodotus of the army halting for its morning meal somewhere between Oasis and the land of the Ammonians is revealing for another reason. Armies do stop for meals, and campaigns are won or lost in such ordinary intervals. A halt means the column relaxes its movement. Men set down burdens. Animals kneel or drift. Discipline softens slightly. Attention narrows toward immediate need. If danger strikes in that moment, the force is not in marching formation and not fully prepared to respond. In a narrative shaped by legend, the meal pause makes the later disaster feel brutally human. The soldiers are not dying in combat. They're doing the most routine thing in the world, eating. Then the world changes around them. Yet even if one strips away the sandstorm motif, the morning halt still feels plausible as a point of vulnerability. An ambush, a failure of guidance, a sudden realization that water estimates are wrong, or a fierce wind reducing visibility could all become more dangerous during a stationary break. Desert conditions can shift quickly. Fine sand and dust can obscure landmarks and throw off orientation. Animals can panic. Units can separate. If the expedition is already exhausted, a modest disruption may have cascading effects. One cluster follows a guide in the wrong direction. Another delays. Another rushes to secure supplies. command becomes confused. The army does not need to disappear in one instant to be lost. It can unravel. This possibility matters because the story of total burial may be the dramatic shell around a more complex collapse. A force can be destroyed by thirst, fragmentation, enemy action, and weather together, with no single theatrical moment accounting for all of it. Some men may die on the route, some may be captured, some may be cut down near wells, some may stray and never rejoin the column. A later tradition, hearing only that the army vanished between known points, may compress all these failures into one image strong enough to survive the storm that swallowed them whole. What survives in the record suggests that once the expedition leaves its staging ground, it enters a zone where certainty thins rapidly. The historian is left trying to reconstruct motion from silence. There is the memory of departure, the rumour of destination, the report of a halt, and then the blank. The men continue westward under a fierce sky, carrying the authority of a king who remains far behind them. Their sandals grind over gravel and sand. Their animals breathe dust. Their guides measure the land by signs invisible to most of the column. Somewhere beyond their line of sight lies the event that will strip them of everything except a story. The sandstorm is the image that refuses to die. It rises at the centre of the legend like a wall, sudden and almost alive, turning daylight into a choking dusk and reducing a royal army to buried silence. In the simplest telling, this is what happened to the soldiers of Cambyses. They marched too far into the Egyptian desert, stopped somewhere between the oasis and their target, and were overwhelmed by a violent wind that drove sand over them until nothing remained visible. The force did not retreat. It did not surrender. It did not leave a battlefield. It became part of the desert floor. For more than 2,000 years, that image has carried the whole mystery, because it is both terrifying and strangely clean. The desert destroys the army in a single act. No politics need to be untangled. No defeat needs to be admitted. No rebel commander needs to be named. The wind becomes the executioner and the historian at once. It is easy to understand why such a story survived. Deserts inspire stories of sudden obliteration because they truly can erase traces faster than many other landscapes. Tracks vanish under moving sand, campsites disappear beneath drift, bones can scatter, weather, or be hidden by dunes. A place that seems solid one year may look different the next. Even modern travellers, equipped with maps, engines, satellite navigation, and containers built for long-distance movement, can still misjudge desert terrain when confidence outruns preparation. For ancient soldiers, the dangers are sharper. A severe dust storm can blind, disorient, clog breathing, scatter animals, and make movement almost impossible. A column caught in such conditions might lose formation quickly. If the storm hits when water is low, or when guides are uncertain, it can turn a bad situation into disaster. But the popular picture of 50,000 men neatly buried beneath a single mountain of sand is harder to accept without caution. Sandstorms can be violent, but they do not always behave like the myth imagines. A storm may bury objects, cover tracks, and build drifts around obstacles. But completely entombing an enormous military force in one moment is a different claim. Bodies, weapons, animals, containers, and equipment would be spread across a wide area. Some soldiers might survive the first storm but die later from thirst or confusion. Some might flee in different directions. Some might find shelter in depressions or behind rock. The evidence remains incomplete, and desert science does not make the traditional version impossible in every detail, but it does make the cleanest version of the legend suspiciously convenient. The wind in Herodotus comes from the south. This detail gives the account a certain realism, because dangerous winds and dust events are part of the Egyptian environment. Later observers know the Kamsin, a hot, dry, dust-laden wind that can sweep across Egypt in the spring and transform the air into a reddish haze. Such winds can be oppressive, disorienting, and unnerving. They are not imaginary. They belong to the lived climate of the region. A storyteller remembering an army lost in the western desert could naturally attach the disaster to such a wind. Yet realism in detail does not prove literal accuracy. A true environmental phenomenon can become the dramatic language through which a different kind of failure is explained. That is the key. The storm may preserve a memory of weather without explaining everything. A dust storm could have struck the expedition and contributed to its breakdown. It could have separated units, damaged supplies, panicked animals, and hidden the route. It could have made an already dangerous crossing fatal. But no single explanation fully accounts for the mystery if the number, route, target, and political circumstances are all uncertain. The storm may be one layer of the story, not the whole story. In that sense, the legend may be less false than compressed. It takes a slow chain of logistical failure, fear, environmental stress, and possibly conflict, and transforms it into one unforgettable event. Ancient storytelling often works this way. It turns process into symbol. An army does not merely run out of water, the desert drinks it. A political defeat does not merely shame an empire, the gods punish arrogance. A confused retreat does not merely end badly. A wind rises and erases everyone. This does not mean ancient people were naive. It means they understood history through moral and cosmic patterns as well as practical causes. In Herodotus's wider portrait, Cambyses repeatedly overreaches. He sends men beyond sensible limits. He offends sacred worlds. He acts as if royal power can command geography itself. The sandstorm completes that pattern beautifully. Too beautifully, perhaps. The king who tries to violate a desert sanctuary loses an army to the desert. For the Ammonians, if they are indeed the source of the final report, the storm explanation would be powerful. It allows them to describe their survival without detailing battle, negotiation, or political complexity. The invaders never truly reach them. They are stopped by the land before human resistance is even required. Such a memory strengthens the prestige of the oracle. The god does not need an army. The desert around the god is enough. Whether this reflects religious interpretation of a real disaster or a later reshaping of events, the result is the same. The failed Persian expedition becomes proof that some places cannot be mastered by force. For the Persians, too, a natural disaster could be a useful explanation, though in a different way. If an imperial force is defeated by rebels, that defeat is politically dangerous. It suggests weakness. It gives names and agency to opponents. It may encourage others. If the same force is lost to a freak storm, the shame changes character. Nature, not resistance, becomes responsible. The king's enemies disappear from the story. The event becomes tragic or ominous rather than humiliating. Scholars still debate how much official Persian memory shaped the tradition that reached Herodotus. But the possibility is worth taking seriously. Empires often prefer disasters without human victors. Modern claims of discovery have repeatedly revived the sandstorm image. The idea of a buried army is irresistible. It invites visions of bronze weapons emerging from dunes, helmets half exposed, bones lying beside arrowheads, a lost column finally returned to daylight. Reports of finds in the western desert have sometimes been presented as possible evidence for Cambyses' soldiers, but careful assessment has not produced a firm consensus. Isolated objects in a desert long used by travelers, Soldiers, pastoralists, and traders are difficult to assign to one famous expedition. A weapon or bone is not automatically a Persian casualty. A fragment of equipment may belong to many periods. Without secure excavation, context, dating, and a pattern of evidence, the lost army remains unfound in the strict archaeological sense. This absence does not end the mystery, it sharpens it. If 50,000 soldiers were truly buried together, one might expect a dramatic archaeological signature, though dunes, erosion, looting, and shifting terrain complicate that expectation. If the force was much smaller, or if it fragmented and died across a broad area, the traces would be far harder to detect. If it was defeated by rebels and its remains were removed, reused, scattered, or never deposited in one place, the archaeological problem changes again. The absence of a spectacular mass grave does not prove that no expedition failed. It only warns against imagining the legend as a photograph. The storm, then, should be treated as both clue and cover. It tells us that ancient memory associated the disaster with the desert's power. It tells us that the disappearance was understood as sudden, total, and terrifying. But it may also hide the slower mechanics of failure water miscalculation, route confusion, hostile terrain, local resistance, and political embarrassment. The wind that fills Herodotus's account may have blown across a real campaign, but by the time it reaches the page, it has become more than weather. It has become a way of making silence meaningful. And so the army remains suspended inside that storm. The men are still at their halt, still somewhere beyond the last secure oasis, still caught between the practical world of logistics and the symbolic world of punishment. Sand moves through the story because sand is what the story has left in place of certainty. To find what may lie beneath it, the search must turn from legend to evidence, and from the dramatic shape of memory to the stubborn fragments that archaeology can actually test. Once the legend is stripped back to its essentials, the question becomes almost brutally simple: what is actually left? If an army truly went west into Egypt's desert in the reign of Cambyses II, if it failed, and if that failure was large enough to echo for centuries, then some trace ought to remain. Not necessarily a dramatic tableau of thousands of skeletons emerging from a dune, but something more stubborn than rumour, a scatter of objects, a chain of campsites, a concentration of weaponry. Human remains with a coherent date and context, administrative records hinting at loss, inscriptions referring to the campaign, oasis evidence showing violence or disruption. Archaeology, however, rarely rewards desire so neatly. What survives is fragmentary, hard to interpret, and often separated from the legend by long stretches of silence. Part of the difficulty lies in the desert itself. People often imagine deserts as perfect preservers, and sometimes they are. Dry conditions can protect wood, leather, cloth, and human remains better than wetter climates do. But deserts are not museums. Wind shifts the surface. Sand covers and uncovers different layers. Flash floods, though rare, can rearrange local deposits. Campsites may be reused over centuries. Ancient routes attract later travellers, later soldiers, later caravans, later looters. A single arrowhead found in open desert tells very little on its own. A few bones without controlled excavation may tell even less. Preservation is possible, but context is everything, and context in the open desert is notoriously fragile. This is why the romantic expectation of one great discovery has proved so difficult to satisfy. Over the years, reports have surfaced claiming that weapons, jewellery, fragments of human remains, or old camp traces in the western desert might belong to Cambyses' lost soldiers. Such stories spread quickly because they answer a longing built into the legend. People want the army to be found in a single moment. They want the sands to open and yield certainty. Yet careful scholars have repeatedly urged restraint. Objects discovered without secure stratigraphy, reliable dating, or clear association with one event cannot bear the weight of such a famous identification. Egypt's deserts have seen countless movements across many centuries. Persian equipment, if found at all, would still need to be demonstrated as part of one specific expedition, not merely part of a broader history of imperial presence. Even mass death in the desert does not automatically produce an obvious archaeological signature. If the expedition fragmented under stress, men may have died across a wide area rather than in one place. If animals scattered, gear was abandoned in stages, and survivors attempted retreat or diversion. The material trace might be thinly spread. Bodies exposed on the surface would not remain untouched forever. Bones could be moved, weathered, broken, or buried in separate episodes. Organic materials might vanish even in dry conditions, while metal could corrode or be taken by later passers-by. The absence of one spectacular grave does not necessarily disprove disaster. It simply removes the easiest version of the story. There is also the problem of scale. The famous number of 50,000 looms over every search. If that figure is broadly accurate, the remains of such a force ought to be immense. If the figure is exaggerated, and the real expedition was far smaller, then the archaeological expectations change. A force of several thousand could still matter politically and militarily, and its disappearance could still generate a legend. But its material footprint would be easier to miss or misidentify, especially if the remains were never deposited together. Scholars still debate the number precisely because the archaeology has not forced agreement. The documentary record is not much kinder. Persian imperial administration was capable of record-keeping, taxation, and communication on a remarkable scale. But survival of documents is uneven and often accidental. For the specific question of a westward army lost under Cambyses, there is no surviving official Persian narrative that confirms Herodotus's dramatic account. That silence matters, though it is not decisive. Empires do not preserve every failure, and ancient archives survive by chance. A lost campaign in a frontier desert, especially if it ended badly and embarrassed the regime, is exactly the kind of event that might leave little formal memory. Silence can hide many things: ignorance, indifference, destruction, or deliberate forgetting. And yet modern archaeology has uncovered something that may be more important than a pile of bones. In the Dakhla oasis, evidence has emerged for a local ruler named Pertubastis IV, an Egyptian rebel who appears to have challenged Persian authority in the early years after Cambyses' conquest. His name survives in inscriptions and associated finds that suggest he was not a later fantasy, but a real political actor. This matters because it places organized resistance in the western oases at precisely the period when the Lost Army legend is supposed to unfold. The desert, in other words, is no longer only a stage for natural catastrophe. It becomes a political landscape. This evidence does not prove that Cambyses' lost army died fighting rebels. It does not even prove that the expedition mentioned by Herodotus and the suppression of western oasis resistance are the same event. The evidence remains incomplete. But what survives in the record suggests that the western desert was more unstable and more politically charged than the old legend alone would imply. If Pertubastis IV established himself in the oasis region, then a Persian response becomes highly plausible. If a response was launched and failed, later memory may have had reason to reshape it. A sandstorm is easier to remember than a rebel king. The distinction is crucial. Archaeology rarely confirms legends by matching them exactly. More often, it complicates them by revealing a different underlying structure. In this case, the material record from the oases hints that Cambyses' Egypt was not securely pacified and that opposition could take organized form away from the Nile. That does not bury Herodotus, it reframes him. The story of an army sent westward may well preserve a real campaign. The dramatic mode of its disappearance may belong to memory. The political setting of its failure may belong to archaeology. Then there are the oasis sites themselves, which pose a quieter problem. Excavation in places like Karga and Dakhla has revealed long histories of occupation, temples, agricultural systems, wells, roads, and changing imperial control. These are rich landscapes, but they are not simple war memorials. Many levels overlap. Later building can disturb earlier remains. Mud brick architecture erodes. Inscriptions survive unevenly. A garrison, a destroyed detachment, or a hurried campaign might leave only slight traces among centuries of habitation. Archaeology excels at patience, but patience often produces ambiguity rather than dramatic resolution. The desert routes are even more elusive. Some tracks were used for generations and leave only shallow or shifting signatures. Camps can be ephemeral. Wells may be reused long after one historical episode has passed. A traveller's pottery sherd and a soldier's broken vessel may look similar without context. In such landscapes, absence of evidence is never entirely comfortable. It can mean nothing happened there, or it can mean that what happened did not preserve well enough for modern recognition. This is why the archaeological record around Cambyses' lost army feels both tantalizing and incomplete. There is no universally accepted field discovery that settles the legend. There is no unearthed mass grave labelled by history with comforting clarity. There are only layers of possibility. There are disputed finds in the open desert. There is the stubborn lack of conclusive military remains on the expected scale. There is the political evidence from the oasis world, pointing toward rebellion and suppression. There is the mismatch between the clean sandstorm tale and the messier patterns archaeology usually reveals. In a way, this is exactly what makes the mystery endure. The evidence has not vanished, but neither has it arranged itself into one final answer. Instead, it survives in pieces, like a broken inscription whose missing lines matter more than the words still visible. Herodotus gives the haunting image. The desert withholds confirmation. Archaeology offers not a burial mound full of certainty, but a set of clues that pull the story away from pure legend and toward a more troubled reality. Somewhere in that gap between narrative and material trace, the lost army still waits. The search for Cambyses' lost army has always been driven by a powerful temptation somewhere, out there beyond the cultivated world. There must be a place where the story becomes visible, a slope of sand, a hollow between dunes, a scatter of bronze or iron, a line of bones beside the remains of pack animals. For generations, the legend has invited people to imagine discovery not as slow interpretation but as revelation. The sudden moment when the desert yields a secret it has guarded since the 6th century before the Common Era. That desire is understandable. The story is built around disappearance, and disappearance creates a hunger for recovery. Yet every serious attempt to locate the army has had to confront the same problem. The western desert is vast, layered, and historically crowded, even where it appears empty. Modern explorers entering this landscape do not step into a blank wilderness. They enter a region crossed by old caravan tracks, dotted with oases, scarred by wind and marked by thousands of years of intermittent movement. Egyptians, Libyans, Persians, Greeks, Romans, nomads, traders, soldiers, monks, colonial surveyors, smugglers, geologists, and archaeologists have all left traces in different places in different centuries. A metal object in the desert is not automatically Persian. A burial is not automatically military. A cluster of bones is not automatically Cambyses' army. The very emptiness that makes the lost army seem findable also makes interpretation treacherous, because isolated finds can be pulled too quickly into a famous story. In the older age of exploration, the search was shaped by maps, local guides, travel endurance, and imagination. Surveyors and adventurers tried to match Herodotus' route to the landscape, asking where the place called Oasis might be, how far a 7-day journey from Thebes would carry a large column, and which paths could lead from the southern Nile valley toward the Ammonians. The most obvious candidates drew attention again and again: Karga, Dakhla, and the wider chain of western oases. Further away, Siwa, with its powerful connection to the Oracle of Amun. But matching text to terrain is never simple. Herodotus gives direction and sequence, but not coordinates. Ancient place names shift. Distances are approximate. Routes depend on wells, seasons, and local knowledge that may not survive in a form modern searchers can easily reconstruct. The search also depends on what one thinks the army was doing. If the target is Siwa, then the search pulls northwestward toward the oracle and the dramatic tradition of the Ammonians. If the target is Dakhla or another southern oasis, the centre of gravity changes completely. A route that seems absurd for an army marching to Siwa might make more sense for a force sent to suppress rebellion in the oasis belt. This is why archaeology has increasingly complicated adventure-style searches. It is not enough to ask where 50,000 men could have been buried by sand. The better question may be where a Persian force would have had political reason to go, which communities could resist it, and how later memory might have turned that failure into the old story. Still, the dramatic search has never disappeared. Reports have periodically claimed that traces of the lost army may have been found. One of the most widely publicized involved discoveries in Egypt's western desert that was said to include weapons, human bones, and other remains possibly connected to Cambyses' soldiers. The announcement caught public imagination because it seemed to offer the long-awaited answer. The army was not only real, but physically present, still lying where the storm had taken it. Images and summaries circulated widely, and the legend briefly seemed to move from Herodotus into archaeology. But the reaction from careful scholars was far more cautious. Finds made outside a secure, fully documented excavation context are difficult to evaluate. Without clear stratigraphy, reliable dating, and a demonstrable connection among the objects, the claim remains fragile. Even if some artifacts are ancient, their age, cultural identity, and relationship to one another must be established before they can be assigned to Cambyses' expedition. A desert used for millennia can produce ancient material from many periods. The evidence remains incomplete, and no broad scholarly consensus has accepted any single discovery as the definitive remains of the lost army. This tension between announcement and verification is one of the quiet dramas of the mystery. Public imagination moves quickly because it loves closure. Archaeology moves slowly because closure without evidence is not discovery. It is storytelling with objects placed inside it. A sword, a bracelet, a skull, a pottery fragment, or a piece of textile may be fascinating, but each must answer hard questions. Where exactly was it found? What layer contained it? What other objects were associated with it? Can it be dated? Does it match known Persian military material? Could it belong to another period? Was the site disturbed? Are the remains human, animal, military, funerary, or domestic? These questions can feel dry compared with the romance of a buried army, but they are the only way to keep mystery from becoming wishful thinking. Satellite imagery and remote sensing have added a new dimension. From above, deserts reveal patterns invisible on foot ancient tracks, settlement traces, paleo-channels, dune fields, geological formations, and possible archaeological anomalies. Technology can narrow search areas and identify features worth investigating. It can help map routes between oases and reconstruct environmental conditions. Yet satellites do not magically label a lost army. A suspicious pattern on an image may be geology, modern disturbance, ancient habitation, military debris from a recent century, or nothing at all. Remote sensing is powerful, but it still requires fieldwork, excavation, dating, and interpretation. The desert can mislead from space as easily as from ground level, only with more impressive images. The deeper modern search, therefore, has shifted from treasure hunt logic toward landscape archaeology. Instead of looking only for a mass burial, scholars examine how the Western oases functioned under Persian rule, where roads ran, how water was managed, how local elites expressed power, and where signs of disruption appear. This approach is less cinematic, but it may be more revealing. If the army vanished after a political defeat, the crucial evidence might not be a buried column at all. It might be inscriptions naming a rebel, traces of administrative change, temple activity, fortifications, or patterns showing that Persian authority in the Oasis region was contested. In that sense, the army may be found indirectly, through the world that destroyed or absorbed it. The Dakhla evidence connected with Petubastis IV has become especially important for this reason. It suggests that the Western Desert was not merely a corridor towards Siwa, but a theatre of political resistance. If an Egyptian rebel ruler established authority there, then any Persian expedition westward may have been part of a struggle that official or later memory preferred not to record plainly. This does not solve the mystery. Scholars still debate the details, and no single explanation fully accounts for the transformation from possible rebellion to Herodotus's sandstorm tale. But it gives the search a new map. The army may not be waiting beneath one dune. It may be hidden inside the distorted memory of a failed campaign. That is the frustration and beauty of the modern investigation. The more tools are brought to the desert, the less the mystery resembles a simple buried object problem. Excavation, satellite survey, historical geography, epigraphy, climate knowledge, and critical reading of ancient texts all point toward a more complicated story. The question is no longer only where the soldiers fell, it is why their fall, if fall there was, came down to us in the form it did. The Western Desert continues to keep its silence, but that silence is not empty. It is filled with routes not yet traced, sites not yet fully understood, and memories that may have been reshaped by fear, pride, and imperial shame. So the search goes on, not always with shovels in sand, but also with maps, inscriptions, old words, and the patience to doubt attractive answers. Somewhere between Karga, Dakhla, Siwa, and the vanished roads of the Achaemenid frontier, the legend still casts its long shadow. The desert has not given up the army. It has only forced each generation to ask more carefully what kind of army they are looking for. By this point, the lost army begins to look less like a single event and more like a struggle over memory. That is often what happens when a historical episode sits at the intersection of conquest, humiliation, sacred geography, and poor evidence. The men may have marched only once, but the story of their disappearance has marched through many minds, each with its own reasons for preserving, reshaping, or embellishing it. What reaches the present is therefore not raw history. It is history after passing through politics, local pride, imperial silence, and the narrative instincts of one of antiquity's greatest storytellers. Egypt had strong reasons to remember Cambyses badly. Foreign conquest was not a small wound to be absorbed without friction. Egypt was a civilization with an immense sense of antiquity, ritual continuity, and royal legitimacy. To be conquered by a foreign king, however capable, was also to endure a violation of established order. It is no surprise that later traditions cast Cambyses as sacrilegious, unstable, or cruel. Such portrayals may preserve real grievances, but they also serve a cultural function. They explain conquest by placing moral failure on the conqueror. The foreign ruler does not simply win, he wins as an impious man whose punishment, somehow, is already on the way. In that emotional landscape, the destruction of a Persian army in the desert becomes more than a military setback. It becomes a kind of balance restored. Local memory in the oasis world may have shaped the story even more sharply. Communities living beyond the Nile's main corridor were not passive scenery in the advance of empires. They had their own political rhythms, local elites, sacred sites, and knowledge systems. If a Persian force moved against them and failed, that failure could become foundational memory. A people threatened by imperial violence might preserve the event as proof that distance, the god, the land, or local resistance protected them. The version Herodotus records, in which the army disappears before reaching the Ammonians, serves exactly that purpose. It transforms the threatened community from a peripheral target into a place so powerful, or so guarded, that the invaders never truly arrive. The land itself becomes partisan. There is another level beneath that. Egyptian political culture was perfectly capable of remembering resistance, even when resistance failed in the long run. A rebel who briefly challenged imperial control could remain important in regional memory, precisely because he represented a crack in the conqueror's image of inevitability. If the emerging archaeological picture around Petubastis IV is relevant here, then the lost army may preserve not only the fear of the desert, but also the ghost of a suppressed Egyptian victory. If Persian troops were destroyed or badly defeated while trying to crush rebellion in the western oases, later imperial memory would have every incentive to blur the identity of the enemy. A storm is a cleaner explanation than a rebel king. A wind has no politics. A defeated army can be pitied. An army beaten by local resistance invites uncomfortable questions. This is where propaganda enters, though not necessarily in the modern sense of a centrally coordinated falsehood. Political memory can be shaped by omission just as much as by declaration. Ancient empires often do not preserve their disasters with enthusiasm. Royal inscriptions celebrate triumph, divine favour, tribute, and order. They do not dwell on bungled expeditions unless those expeditions can be rhetorically converted into something else. If a Western campaign under Cambyses failed, Persian official memory may simply have allowed it to sink. The vacuum that followed would then be filled by others: Egyptian resentment, oasis pride, Greek curiosity, and later moralizing interpretations. Greek storytelling adds yet another layer. Herodotus is not inventing in a vacuum, but he is also not merely transcribing neutral reports. He writes with a profound interest in the relationship between power and limit. Great kings in his work frequently overreach. Their ambitions expand faster than their judgment, geography, fortune, custom, and the gods place boundaries before them, and the drama lies in their refusal to see those boundaries clearly. Cambyses, as Herodotus presents him, fits this pattern well. The failed Ethiopian campaign, the harsh treatment of sacred and political institutions, and the dispatch of the army against the Ammonians all contribute to a portrait of excess. In such a narrative universe, the lost army is not just an isolated mystery. It is a perfect lesson. It shows what happens when imperial anger mistakes remoteness for weakness. That does not mean Herodotus is useless as evidence. On the contrary, he is valuable precisely because his text preserves multiple layers of memory at once. The story likely survives because something serious did happen. An expedition westward was probably remembered because it mattered. But the final shape of the account may tell us less about the mechanics of disappearance than about how ancient people wanted the event to mean. The sandstorm may not simply describe the event. It may interpret it. It says that the king's will ran into a force beyond control. It says that the desert, or fate, or the god of the place, had the final word. It says that some frontiers punish arrogance not with battle, but with erasure. Myth in this context is not the opposite of history. It is one of history's afterlives. When evidence is incomplete and emotions remain strong, narrative condenses complexity into memorable form. The lost army myth may therefore contain several truths at once. It may preserve the memory of a genuine Persian expedition. It may preserve a real catastrophe in the desert, whether weather-related or logistical. It may preserve, beneath the surface, a suppressed outline of resistance in the oasis world. It may preserve Egyptian satisfaction at seeing a conqueror checked, and it may preserve the Greek appetite for stories in which great rulers learn that not every landscape can be commanded. No single explanation fully accounts for why this particular story endured while so many other ancient failures vanished. Part of the answer lies in scale. 50,000 men, even if exaggerated, gives the event unforgettable weight. Part lies in imagery. The idea of an army buried by sand is more haunting than an ordinary defeat. Part lies in setting. The western desert is already a natural theatre of disappearance, a place where the horizon itself seems to consume certainty. And part lies in usefulness. Different groups could adapt the story without fully agreeing on its meaning. To Egyptians, it could be a sign of divine or moral justice. To oasis communities, it could affirm local sacred power. To Greeks, it could illustrate the dangers of despotism and overreach. To later readers, it could remain what it still is now, a mystery that feels just close enough to solve. Propaganda, memory, and myth are often treated as if they contaminate history, but in cases like this, they are part of the evidence. They reveal what different societies found meaningful, shameful, or worth preserving. If a Persian defeat in the western desert was politically inconvenient, then distortion is exactly what one should expect. If a sacred community wanted to remember survival as divine protection, then stylization is also what one should expect. The historian's task is not to peel away the legend and imagine that a pure, untouched core waits beneath it. The task is to understand how the legend itself was built and what pressures shaped it. That is why the Lost Army still resists final capture. It does not live only in the sand. It lives in the choices made by those who told the story after the soldiers were gone, somewhere between a failed desert expedition, a damaged imperial reputation, local resistance, and a narrative of punishment, memory hardened into tradition. The army disappeared once in the landscape. It disappeared again in the politics of remembrance. Recovering it now means tracing not only where men may have died, but how a defeat may have been turned into one of antiquity's most enduring and useful legends. The deeper the mystery goes, the less it behaves like a puzzle with one missing piece. It becomes a field of competing explanations, each strong enough to illuminate part of the story and weak enough to leave something unresolved. The oldest and most famous answer is still the sandstorm. It has the elegance of a single cause and the terror of a single image. A violent wind rises, sand covers the soldiers, and the army disappears without witnesses. It explains the silence. It explains the absence of survivors in the tradition. It fits the moral shape of Herodotus's account, where Cambyses pushes into sacred and dangerous territory and loses men to a force beyond command. But its very neatness is also its weakness. A storm may have contributed to disaster, perhaps even decisively. Yet the complete burial of a huge army in one sudden event remains difficult to prove and difficult to imagine in the simplest popular form. The sandstorm is powerful as memory. As an archaeological explanation, it demands more evidence than the desert has given. A second explanation is less dramatic but more practical. The army may have taken the wrong route, or followed a route that became fatal under pressure. In desert travel, a wrong route does not need to be wildly wrong. A few misjudged days, a failed well, a delay caused by exhausted animals, or a misunderstanding between commanders and guides can be enough. A large expedition does not wander like a lone traveller. It unravels slowly. The front may continue while the rear falls behind. Pack animals may be lost. Water discipline may fail. Commanders may press forward because turning back seems equally dangerous. If the force missed a crucial water source or overestimated the next one, the disaster would not need enemies or supernatural punishment. It would need only distance, heat, thirst, and the stubborn refusal of logistics to forgive pride. This explanation fits much of what is known about desert campaigning. It also fits the caution modern scholars bring to the number 50,000. A very large army moving through water-poor terrain is not automatically stronger than a smaller one. It may be more vulnerable because its needs are enormous. If the figure is exaggerated, the same logic still applies. A smaller but significant force could collapse if supplies ran short or guides failed. The evidence remains incomplete. But the logistical theory has the advantage of requiring no miraculous burial and no perfectly staged catastrophe. It imagines the lost army not as swallowed in one breath, but as worn down by a series of decisions that looked survivable until they were not. A third explanation turns from terrain to human conflict. The army may have been defeated, not by weather, but by people who knew the western desert better than the Persians did. This possibility becomes especially important once the oasis evidence connected with Pertubastis IV is taken seriously. If a rebel ruler held influence in Dakhla or nearby regions, then a Persian expedition westward may have been moving into hostile political territory. Local resistance would not need to meet the Persians in a grand open battle. It could control wells, deny supplies, mislead guides, attack small detachments, and exploit the army's vulnerability as it moved away from the Nile. In such terrain, knowledge becomes a weapon. The desert favors those who know when to wait. This theory also explains why later memory might prefer the sandstorm. A natural disaster embarrasses no named rebel. A defeat by Egyptian resistance is different. It gives agency to the conquered. It suggests that Persian rule in Egypt was not secure. It makes the empire look vulnerable at precisely the moment when it needs to appear inevitable. If the campaign failed against Petubastis or another oasis-based opposition, the transformation of that failure into a storm legend becomes politically understandable. The storm does not necessarily invent the disappearance, it removes the victor. But the rebellion theory has its own uncertainties. The evidence for Petubastis IV is important, yet the connection between him and Herodotus' lost army cannot be proven beyond dispute. The timing, geography, and nature of the campaign remain debated. It is possible that an oasis rebellion and the lost army tradition are related, but it is also possible that later interpretation has drawn two nearby historical problems too tightly together. Archaeology gives a political landscape in which a failed Persian expedition makes sense. It does not hand over the final scene. A fourth explanation combines weather, logistics, and resistance into a single chain. This may be the most historically realistic possibility, because disasters rarely obey the tidy boundaries of later storytelling. The army could have set out with inadequate supplies, entered difficult terrain, encountered hostile local conditions, suffered from faulty intelligence, faced attacks or obstruction near wells, and then been struck by a severe windstorm at the worst possible moment. A storm in that case would not be the whole cause, it would be the final blow. It would scatter the column, hide landmarks, panic animals, and turn an already dangerous situation into collapse. Survivors might be captured, absorbed, killed in later fighting, or die attempting to return. Later storytellers, hearing of the disaster in compressed form, would remember the storm because the storm gave shape to everything. This layered explanation lacks the clean elegance of legend, but it may be closer to how ancient campaigns fail. Armies are seldom destroyed by one factor alone. They are destroyed when several weaknesses align. A confident command structure becomes brittle, supplies shrink, the environment worsens, local enemies gain advantage, communication falters. Then one event, perhaps a storm, perhaps an ambush, perhaps the discovery that the next well is dry, breaks the remaining order. When survivors are few or politically inconvenient, the details vanish first, the symbol remains. There is also the exaggeration theory. Perhaps no army of 50,000 vanished at all. Perhaps a smaller Persian detachment was lost, defeated, or forced to withdraw, and the story grew in the telling. Ancient numbers often expand as memory turns failure into wonder. 50,000 may mean not an audited military roster, but a great many, enough to make the disappearance feel worthy of history. This does not make the story worthless. A smaller lost force could still mark a serious imperial failure, but it does change what archaeologists should expect. If searchers imagine a vast buried host, when the real event involved a smaller column scattered across a hostile landscape, they may be looking for the wrong kind of evidence. Finally, there is the most skeptical explanation: the story may be largely literary or legendary, built around Cambyses' dark reputation and the Greek taste for moralized disaster. In this view, the lost army functions as a narrative punishment rather than a recoverable event. Cambyses threatens a remote sacred place, and the desert destroys his men before they can violate it. The tale confirms the arrogance of the tyrant and the power of sacred geography. This interpretation deserves attention because Herodotus' account is indeed shaped by theme and moral pattern. Yet total skepticism may go too far. The story's specific geography, its connection to oasis routes, and the later archaeological signs of unrest in the western desert all suggest that it may preserve something more than invention. Pure fiction is possible, but an altered memory of a real failure feels harder to dismiss. The competing explanations therefore do not cancel one another neatly. They overlap. The army may have been smaller than Herodotus claims. It may have gone toward a target different from the one later tradition remembered. It may have faced rebels rather than only sand. It may have suffered from logistical collapse made worse by weather. It may have been politically inconvenient enough for memory to replace human defeat with natural catastrophe. Scholars still debate the balance among these possibilities, and no single explanation fully accounts for the tradition, the geography, the silence, and the later evidence. What remains is not a solved mystery, but a narrowed one. The old image of 50,000 men buried at once by a sandstorm is no longer enough. It is too simple for the world that produced it. Yet the opposite claim, that nothing happened and the whole story can be discarded, is also too simple. Somewhere between those extremes lies the most haunting possibility: a real Persian force did enter the Western Desert. A real crisis overtook it. And the truth of that crisis was reshaped until the desert itself became the only named killer. The soldiers vanished from the road, but the explanations multiplied. Each one casts a different shadow, and none yet reaches the bottom of the sand. The farther this story moves from the Nile, the more important it becomes to remember that the Western Desert is not merely an emptiness surrounding civilization. It is a lived world. Long before and long after Cambyses, people know how to survive there, how to move through it, how to coax life from springs and shallow groundwater, how to read wind and ground, and how to turn isolation into advantage. The great irony at the heart of the Lost Army legend is that the place said to swallow a huge imperial force is also a place where smaller human communities endure for generations. The desert is deadly, but it is not uniformly hostile. It is selective. It rewards those who understand it and punishes those who try to cross it as if it were only a blank interval between richer lands. The oases are the key to this hidden world. Seen from outside, they can appear miraculous, like green accidents scattered through barren distance. Seen from within, they are intricate human landscapes. Springs and wells support palms, grain cultivation, orchards, mud brick settlements, livestock, and ritual life. Water must be managed carefully. Fields are precious. Shade is infrastructure. Storage, timing, and local cooperation matter constantly. Life is possible not because the desert is conquered, but because communities learn to work with its limits. An oasis is therefore more than relief from hardship. It is a compact social system, tightly bound to ecology. Karga, Dakhla, Farafra, Bahariya. And Siwa are not interchangeable points on a map. Each has its own environmental character, historical relationships, and role in wider networks. Some sit closer to Nile access routes. Some connect more strongly toward Libya or deeper desert tracks. Some occupy more direct positions in the chain of movement between Upper Egypt and the Western interior. Their differences matter because political control in such regions is never abstract. An imperial center does not simply possess the desert. It negotiates, taxes, garrisons, patronizes, threatens, and sometimes fails. The lived geography of the oases can either support that control or quietly resist it. This is why local knowledge is a form of power. A well is not only water, it is a strategic fact. A passable route at one season may be punishing in another. A cluster of vegetation may signal hidden moisture to those who know how to read it. A caravan can move by habits of timing and route choice invisible to outsiders. In oasis societies, such knowledge is ordinary, inherited, and practical. To a large outside army, it can be the difference between life and ruin. What seems like a remote backwater from a royal capital may therefore be a place where local people hold the strongest cards. The desert peoples and oasis communities beyond the Nile also occupy an uncertain place in the imagination of river civilizations. They can be seen as peripheral, difficult, exotic, or threatening. Yet they are often deeply connected to the larger states around them. They trade dates, salt, animals, minerals, and services. They guide caravans. They transmit information. They shelter fugitives or facilitate movement between regions. They are frontier populations in the fullest sense. Close enough to empire to matter, distant enough to retain leverage. That combination makes them politically significant and often misunderstood. For the Persians, newly installed as rulers of Egypt, these oasis worlds would have posed a serious challenge. The empire is skilled at governing diverse populations, but every frontier has its own language of control. What works in a delta city or along the Nile may not work in the desert chain. Officials need local intermediaries. Supplies must travel differently. The distance from major garrisons matters. Sacred places cannot be ignored. If rebellion or refusal emerges in an oasis, suppressing it may require more than dispatching troops. It may require understanding a landscape the conquerors do not yet fully command. This helps explain how a Western expedition, whether aimed at Siwa, Dakhla, or another oasis region, could run into difficulty beyond the obvious problem of thirst. It could meet a human environment organized around selective openness. Locals might trade and guide under one circumstance, resist and conceal under another. Wells might be accessible in theory but denied in practice. Information could be partial or manipulated. A column dependent on cooperation may not always know when that cooperation has shifted. In such conditions, the line between environmental hazard and human opposition becomes blurred. An army can die of thirst because the desert is harsh. It can also die of thirst because people who know the desert have decided not to help. The sacred dimension of oasis life matters too. Temples in the oases are not mere copies of Nile institutions dropped into remote settings. They connect local communities to broader Egyptian religion while preserving regional importance. The oracle associated with Amun in the far west is only the most famous example. Sacred authority in a frontier zone can become politically potent precisely because it is not fully controlled by the center. A sanctuary can validate rulers, interpret danger, and gather prestige across distances. An imperial power that feels uncertain may see such places as threats. A local community may see them as anchors of identity. When Greek and later traditions imagine the Western desert, they often do so with a mix of fascination and simplification. Oases become islands, oracles become mysterious voices, and the spaces between settlements become theatres of marvel and danger. There is truth in that imagery, but it can obscure the ordinary human work that made life there possible. A lesser-known but important detail is that desert survival often depends not on dramatic heroism, but on routine precision, knowing when to move animals, how to protect stored water, how to read a sky full of dust, where to dig, when to conserve, whom to trust. These are the skills that make small communities durable and large invading forces brittle. If the lost army truly entered this world, then one reason it disappeared from history may be that it passed from imperial space into local space without understanding the difference. On the Nile, the Persians could occupy the symbols of power and make power visible. In the desert, power was less theatrical and more intimate. It lived in wells, paths, springs, storehouses, alliances, and memory. A king could command an expedition westward, but he could not command the desert to reveal itself in imperial terms. The figure of Petubastes IV, though still surrounded by scholarly debate and incomplete evidence, belongs naturally in this setting. A rebel based in the Oasis region is not an anomaly. He's a sign that frontier landscapes can produce their own political centres under the right conditions. Distance from the main imperial corridor creates opportunity. Sacred and local prestige can be mobilised. Support can gather around the promise that the conqueror's reach is not infinite. Even if Petubastes was eventually suppressed, the very existence of such resistance reveals how alive the Western Desert was as a political zone. All of this changes the emotional tone of the mystery. The old legend speaks of men swallowed by empty sand. The fuller picture suggests something more human and more unsettling. The army may have vanished in a region that was not empty at all, but inhabited by people for whom the desert was home, and for whom imperial intrusion may have been answered with patience, defiance, or strategic silence. The landscape did not merely erase the Persians, it may have sided through its local masters against them. That possibility deepens the tragedy and also restores balance to the story. The Western Desert was never only a stage for imperial ambition or classical legend. It was a world with its own logic, one that made survival possible for some and impossible for others. To understand why an army could disappear there, one must first understand the people who did not disappear. The people who lived among springs and palms and rock and wind, and who knew that what seems empty to outsiders is often full of hidden structure. Cambyses himself remains as difficult to grasp as the army said to have vanished under his command. He stands at the edge of history in a harsh light, visible enough to be important, distorted enough to be dangerous. He is not a minor ruler whose life can be reduced to one strange episode in the desert. He is the son of Cyrus the Great, heir to an empire that has already transformed the political map of Western Asia, and conqueror of Egypt. One of the most prestigious victories any Persian king could claim. Yet the memory that clings to him is unusually dark. In Greek and Egyptian tradition, he often appears as arrogant, violent, impious, unstable, and doomed. Whether that portrait reflects the man himself, the anger of conquered Egypt, Greek suspicion of Eastern monarchy, or later political storytelling remains one of the central problems in reading his reign. The difficulty begins with success. Cambyses does what few foreign rulers had done so completely. He takes Egypt and attaches it to the Achaemenid world. This is not a small addition. Egypt brings grain, wealth, skilled administrators, naval possibilities, and immense symbolic value. A Persian king ruling Egypt can present himself not merely as conqueror, but as legitimate pharaoh, successor to an ancient line, guardian of temples, and lord of the two lands. To later memory, however, conquest alone is not enough to secure honour. A king who wins by force may still be remembered as a violator if the conquered culture finds his rule intolerable or sacrilegious. This is why stories about Cambyses often gather around temples, sacred animals, priests, and ritual insult. Some traditions accuse him of mocking Egyptian religion, damaging sanctuaries, and acting with contempt toward customs he did not understand. The most famous hostile accounts make him seem almost like the opposite of proper kingship, a ruler who has power but lacks restraint. Scholars still debate how much of this is reliable. Persian rulers often showed practical respect for local cults, because temples were essential to administration and legitimacy. It would have been politically foolish to destroy the institutions needed to govern Egypt. At the same time, conquest can produce real violence, confiscation, humiliation, and disruption, especially in moments of resistance. the truth may lie between total demonization and total defense. Cambyses may not have been the mad desecrator of later legend, but neither was conquest a gentle process. His troubled image is made worse by the way his reign ends. While he is away from the Persian heartland, political crisis erupts. Ancient accounts describe a pretender claiming royal legitimacy, linked in tradition to the figure of Bardia or Smerdis, Cambyses' brother. The details are notoriously tangled. According to later royal and Greek narratives, Cambyses had secretly caused his brother's death, and an impostor then seized the opportunity to claim the throne. Whether this story preserves the truth, official propaganda, or a mixture of both remains debated. What matters for Cambyses' legacy is that his final months are surrounded by suspicion, succession crisis, and instability. The conqueror of Egypt dies before he can fully stabilize the empire he has expanded. His victory in the Nile Valley is followed not by serene consolidation, but by a struggle over royal memory itself. That struggle matters because the new regime under Darius I has reasons to shape how earlier events are remembered. Darius needs to justify his own rise. He needs to explain why the throne passed to him and why opponents were illegitimate. In such a context, the reputations of Cambyses, Bardia, and other claimants become politically useful material. The past is not simply recorded, it is organized to support the present. If Cambyses' reign already contained failures, rebellions, or embarrassing losses, later narratives could emphasize, soften, or rearrange them according to need. Political memory after the Persian conquest of Egypt is therefore not a neutral container, it is an arena. The lost army fits into this atmosphere with unusual precision. If Cambyses sends troops into the western desert and they vanish, the disaster reflects badly on him. If they vanish while attacking a sacred oracle, the failure becomes moral punishment. If they are defeated by an Egyptian rebel in the oasis region, the embarrassment becomes political. If the campaign is connected to the early resistance of Petubastis IV, then it threatens the image of Persian control at the very moment when that image needs reinforcement. A sandstorm can bury more than soldiers. It can bury responsibility, agency, and shame. This does not mean that someone deliberately invented the storm in a single act of deception. Memory is rarely so simple. Instead, different pressures may have pushed the story in the same direction. Egyptians hostile to Cambyses could remember the loss as divine judgment. Oasis communities could remember it as proof of local sacred protection. Persian silence could leave the details open. Greek storytelling could frame the event as one more sign of royal overreach over time. The most memorable version survives. The king sends an army against the Western sacred world, and the desert erases it. The story becomes emotionally true even if the mechanics remain uncertain. Cambyses' legacy is therefore inseparable from the problem of sources. The Persians themselves left royal inscriptions and administrative traces, but not the kind of full narrative history that would allow modern readers to check every Greek accusation. Egyptian evidence is rich in some areas and silent in others. Greek writers preserve vivid stories, but often from outside Persian court politics and through hostile or fascinated lenses. No single tradition can be trusted alone. The evidence remains incomplete, and the king who emerges from it is a composite figure conqueror, administrator, foreign pharaoh, alleged sacrilege maker, imperial heir, and narrative warning. There is a human element in this distortion. Cambyses is remembered less as a man living through unstable decisions than as a symbol of what happens when power outruns wisdom. That symbolic Cambyses is useful. He teaches that foreign conquest can violate sacred order. He teaches that kings who push too far into unknown lands are punished. He teaches that empire, however large, has borders it cannot see. The lost army becomes one of the sharpest expressions of that lesson. It gives the king's failure a landscape. His ambition enters the desert. The desert answers by refusing to return his men. But the historical Cambyses may have been more complicated than the legend allows. He was ruling in the shadow of Cyrus, a nearly impossible inheritance. He faced the task of integrating Egypt into a rapidly expanding empire. He had to manage military occupation, temple politics, regional loyalties, and frontier unrest. He operated in a world where information moved slowly, where local elites could cooperate or resist, and where distance itself could distort authority. A Western expedition, whether against Siwa, Dakla, or a rebellious oasis power, would not have been an act of random madness. It would have belonged to the hard practical work of conquest. The tragedy is that practical imperial decisions can later be remembered only through the ruins they leave behind. In the end, Cambyses' reputation becomes another desert. It contains real features, but they are half-buried, wind-worn, and difficult to map. His Egyptian conquest is undeniable. His alleged crimes are debated. His political troubles are real but filtered through later justification. His lost army may be fact, legend, or a distorted memory of rebellion. What survives suggests a ruler whose power was immense but not secure, whose achievements were overshadowed by stories of excess, and whose name became attached to one of the most haunting disappearances of the ancient world. The army's fate may never be separated fully from Cambyses' shadow. If he had been remembered as a careful and pious administrator, perhaps the legend would have taken another form. But because he was remembered as a king who crossed limits, the desert story found the perfect ruler to carry it. His troubled legacy gave the disappearance meaning. The soldiers vanished into sand, but Cambyses vanished into reputation, and both forms of disappearance have proved difficult to undo. Some ancient mysteries remain alive because they are unsolved. The lost army of Cambyses endures for a more complex reason. It remains alive because it sits at the exact point where several kinds of fascination meet and reinforce one another. It is a military mystery, a desert mystery, an imperial mystery, a textual mystery, and an archaeological mystery all at once. Remove any one of those elements, and the story would still be interesting. Combine them, and it becomes almost impossible to let go. Part of the endurance lies in the setting. The western desert of Egypt is one of those landscapes that seems to invite the imagination to move ahead of evidence. The scale is immense, the emptiness feels deceptive. Heat, silence, and long distances create a sense that ordinary historical rules may weaken there. A battlefield near a city can be revisited and mapped. A sunken ship can be located on a seabed. A palace archive can be unearthed from mud brick collapse. But a desert disappearance feels different. Sand shifts, routes blur, horizons repeat. The landscape looks as though it has been designed for secrets. That alone gives the lost army a kind of permanence. Even when the evidence is thin, the setting keeps the possibility open. The story also endures because it places a huge empire in a posture of helplessness. The Achaemenid Persian Empire is remembered as one of the supreme powers of the ancient world, disciplined, wealthy, administratively brilliant, and geographically vast. To imagine such an empire losing an entire force without battle, without witness, and without a confirmed grave is deeply unsettling. It reverses the normal emotional order of imperial history. Usually it is small peoples who disappear under the march of great armies. Here the great army disappears instead. The asymmetry gives the story its sting. The lost soldiers become a reminder that scale is not the same as security. There is also the emotional power of absence itself. Many ancient disasters are terrible but legible. One can point to the ruins of a city, the bones from a massacre, the ash that buried a town, the inscriptions that record defeat. The lost army offers no such stable anchor. What people receive instead is a gap shaped like an event. 50,000 men go into the desert, and afterward there is only report, argument, and sand. Human beings are drawn to missing things. A body that is not recovered, a city that is not located, a text that survives only in fragments, a tomb that remains unfound, all possess a peculiar hold on attention. They deny closure, and denial is a powerful engine of cultural memory. Modern media has amplified that effect rather than reducing it. Each generation retells the story in its own style. Explorers frame it as a challenge. Documentaries frame it as a hunt. Popular articles frame it as a rediscovery waiting to happen. Internet discussions frame it as a baffling fact from the ancient world. Every retelling refreshes the mystery, but most also simplify it. They often return to the cleanest and most cinematic version. Cambyses sends 50,000 men to destroy the oracle of Amun, and a sandstorm buries them alive. It is concise, visual, and chilling. Archaeological skepticism, political reinterpretation, and debates over Petrobastis or the oasis routes are more complex, so they travel less easily in popular culture. Yet the newer interpretations do not weaken fascination. They intensify it, because they add a second mystery behind the first. Not only did an army vanish, but history itself may have rewritten the reasons. That layered uncertainty gives the story unusual durability in the modern imagination. There is room for many kinds of reader and viewer. Some are drawn to desert catastrophe, some are drawn to imperial failure, some are drawn to the archaeology of the western oases. Some care about Herodotus and the problem of ancient sources. Some are interested in how political memory hides embarrassing defeat. The Lost Army can accommodate all of them because it has not settled into one definitive explanation. It remains open, but not empty. Enough is known to keep the search meaningful. Not enough is known to end it. There is another reason the mystery endures, and it is subtler. The story exposes something uncomfortable about historical knowledge itself. People often imagine the ancient world as far away but basically recoverable, as if careful excavation and better technology will eventually reveal every major truth. Many times that confidence is justified. Archaeology has recovered astonishing amounts of lost history, but the Lost Army reminds us that some events can remain partly inaccessible even when they happened within literate civilizations, and even when a famous historian wrote about them. The past is not a vault that always opens if one has the right tools. Sometimes it is a landscape that has already filtered memory through fear, pride, weather, and silence. This makes the mystery feel modern in an unexpected way. It is not only about what happened to Persian soldiers in the 6th century before the Common Era, it is also about how narratives harden, how explanations are chosen, and how difficult it is to recover human reality once politics and legend have done their work. In that sense, the Lost Army belongs to a broad family of enduring historical fascinations events where the surviving story is compelling enough to survive, but unstable enough to remain suspect. The enduring appeal lies not simply in ignorance, but in tension between what can be imagined and what can be demonstrated. The Western Desert also continues to give the story fresh life because archaeological work there is ongoing, and the region still feels underexplored in the public imagination. Every new inscription from an oasis site, every fresh survey of desert roads, every refined reconstruction of Persian administration in Egypt can potentially affect the debate. Most discoveries will not be dramatic. They will arrive in fragments, contexts, and cautious publications. But because the central mystery remains unresolved, even small additions feel charged. A single inscription naming a local ruler, a reassessment of oasis chronology, or a better understanding of ancient route systems can shift the balance of plausibility. The story survives partly because it is still research active, still capable of moving. No single explanation fully accounts for this endurance, just as no single explanation fully accounts for the army's disappearance. But together, the reasons form a pattern. The setting is evocative, the source is famous, the empire is immense, the evidence is incomplete, the image is unforgettable, the politics are complicated, the archaeology is suggestive but unresolved, and the emotional center is pure absence. That combination is rare. It gives the lost army the quality of a permanent threshold, always inviting entry, never fully yielding what lies beyond. So the mystery endures not in spite of modern scholarship, but alongside it. Herodotus still provides the haunting story. Archaeology still asks whether the story is misframed. The desert still withholds easy confirmation. Readers and researchers still return because the question remains alive in more than one register. Where did the soldiers go? What really happened in the western oases? Was it a sandstorm, a rebellion, a political cover-up, a logistical collapse? Or some mixture of all of them? Each answer clarifies one piece and darkens another. That is why the lost army still walks through cultural memory after so many centuries. It is not only a problem to be solved, it is a symbol of how the past can remain present by refusing completion. The soldiers vanish, the explanations multiply, and the desert keeps enough silence in reserve to make the story feel unfinished every time it is told. In the end, the lost army of Cambyses remains suspended between sand and memory. It is close enough to history to resist dismissal, and distant enough from proof to resist capture. A Persian king really did conquer Egypt. The western desert really did matter to the stability of that conquest. Oases such as Kerga, Dakhla, and Siwa were not empty ornaments at the edge of a map, but living centers of water, movement, sacred authority, and local power. Herodotus really did preserve a story of a force sent westward and lost between known places. Modern archaeology really has raised the possibility that the old legend may conceal not only a natural disaster, but a political crisis involving oasis resistance and the troubled memory of Persian rule. And yet, when all these facts are gathered, the central image remains unresolved men marching away from the Nile, and then silence. That silence is the hardest evidence of all, because it can be made to serve many explanations. In the traditional version, silence follows a storm. The wind rises, the sand moves, and the army is buried so completely that no messenger returns. In a logistical version, silence follows collapse. Water runs low, animals fail, roots break down, and the force disintegrates in stages too scattered to preserve a single account. In a political version, silence follows defeat. A Persian expedition is destroyed or humiliated by rebels in the oasis region, and later memory removes the human victors by giving the victory to the desert itself. In the most skeptical version, silence follows exaggeration. A smaller event, perhaps a failed detachment or an aborted campaign, grows into a tale of 50,000 men swallowed by sand. Each version has its logic. None can claim the whole field. The most responsible answer may be the least theatrical. Something probably lies behind the story, but not necessarily the exact scene that later imagination prefers. A Persian force may have entered the western desert in the unstable years after the conquest of Egypt. It may have been sent to assert authority over a region not fully controlled by the new regime. It may have encountered the brutal arithmetic of water and distance. It may have faced opposition from people who knew the oasis world better than any imperial officer could. A storm may have struck, perhaps remembered because it was real, perhaps because it became the language through which disaster was understood. Over time, practical failure, political embarrassment, sacred interpretation, and desert fear may have fused into one unforgettable legend. The number 50,000 still stands like a monument inside the tale, but it may be a monument made of memory rather than census. It gives the disappearance scale, and scale gives the legend force. Yet the human reality behind the number matters more than the exact count, whether thousands marched or far fewer. The men who entered the desert were not abstractions. They were soldiers of an empire, likely drawn from different lands, speaking different languages, carrying different habits, fears, and loyalties. Some may have been Persians, others may have belonged to subject peoples of the empire. Some may have been veterans. Some may have expected a difficult but ordinary campaign. None could have known that, if the tradition preserves a real disaster, their final movement westward would become a mystery still retold more than 2 millennia later. Their commanders may have believed the operation was manageable. That is how many disasters begin. A route has been described. Supplies have been counted. Guides have been assigned. A king's command has been delivered. On the first day, the plan still appears to exist. On the second, it begins to meet the landscape. By the time danger becomes obvious, turning back may seem as dangerous as pressing forward. This is the cruel rhythm of desert failure. Catastrophe does not always announce itself as catastrophe. It may first appear as delay, discomfort, thirst, confusion, argument, or the discovery that the next well is farther away than expected. If there was resistance, it may have been almost invisible to later imperial memory. Oasis power did not need to look like a great army opposing another great army on open ground. It could work through intelligence, wells, refusal, ambush, alliances, and the slow wearing down of outsiders. To an imperial chronicler, such defeat might look unworthy of preservation. To local memory, it might look like divine protection or heroic endurance. To Herodotus, receiving stories shaped by many mouths, it might become the tale of a desert wind. That is why the modern mystery is not simply where the army lies. The harder question is what kind of event would leave exactly this kind of trace dramatic in literature, faint in archaeology, politically suggestive in later evidence, and impossible to settle with confidence. The lost army may be missing not only because the desert hid bodies, but because history hid causes. A battlefield can vanish under dunes, but so can the name of the people who won it. A failed campaign can be remembered as weather. A rebellion can be softened into rumour. The absence itself may be partly manufactured. Still, the legend should not be stripped of its power in the name of caution. The caution makes it stronger. A simple story of 50,000 soldiers buried by a sandstorm is haunting, but a story in which that image may conceal a deeper political defeat is even more disturbing. It means the desert did not merely kill, it helped history forget. It means the silence after the march is not passive. It is shaped by fear, pride, geography, and the needs of power. So the soldiers remain where the evidence leaves them, somewhere between oasis and oracle, between Dakla and Siwa, between Herodotus and archaeology, between sandstorm and suppression. The desert has not returned them as a mass of proof. The archives have not explained them. The inscriptions have only widened the frame. What survives is a mystery with enough substance to matter and enough uncertainty to endure. And perhaps that is fitting. The Western Desert has always taught a severe lesson about human ambition. It allows movement, but never cheaply. It permits settlement, but only through knowledge and discipline. It can shelter communities and destroy armies. It can preserve a sandal, a text, a seed, or a body for centuries, and it can also erase a road in a single season of wind. Cambyses' empire, for all its reach, entered that world as a guest that mistook itself for a master. Whether the army fell to storm, thirst, rebels, miscalculation, or memory, the result is the same in the long view. The command went out from the king, the men marched west. The desert kept the answer. After so many centuries, the story slows into something quieter than a hunt. The eye no longer looks only for helmets in the sand or bones beneath a dune. It begins to see the wider shape of time around the mystery, the Nile flowing green and certain, the oases holding their small circles of life, the desert roads fading and returning, the names of kings rising and sinking in memory. Cambyses is gone, Herodotus is gone. The soldiers, whether 50,000 or far fewer, are gone. Even the arguments around them have become part of the long afterlife of the event. What remains is the feeling of a human story almost recovered, then lost again at the edge of proof. There may have been a morning halt, there may have been wind, there may have been fear moving through the column as the horizon disappeared. There may have been wells denied, guides doubted, orders shouted into dust, men trying to find the path back toward the river. Or there may have been a political defeat so uncomfortable that later, memory preferred the cleaner mercy of a storm. The evidence does not let the past speak in one voice. But the silence is not empty. It holds the weight of empire and the fragility of command. It holds the knowledge of desert people who survived where armies failed. It holds the old power of sacred places beyond easy control. It holds the strange mercy and cruelty of landscapes that remember without explaining. In the last image, the desert is calm again. The wind has settled. The sky is wide and pale. Somewhere far away, the Nile continues its ancient work, carrying silt, boats, prayers, and royal names toward the sea, out west among stone, sand, and the hidden roots of palms. The road disappears into light. No banner moves there now. No order crosses the distance. Only the dunes remain, patient and unreadable, keeping beneath them whatever truth history could not carry home.